Welcome to the mystery of Manor Farmhouse. Well, I say mystery. It's not really a mystery about when the house was built or who lived there or whether it was haunted or played some important part in history. In fact, it's part of a wider mystery relating to the origins of my grandmother. But this house played an important part in her early life, and it's a crucial clue in a chain of links that connect her origins in Belgium with her future life growing up and eventually leaving to take up a place at boarding school in Sleephall, Cambridgeshire. Why is it a mystery? Well, it's really difficult to work out why she lived in this house and who she lived with. And what I want to do is explain some of the techniques I've used to just put a little bit of flesh on the bones and understand the context of her first years in England, having come over, we think, round about 1914 at the outbreak of the First World War. So this is a bit of a fusion between genealogy and house history. I'll explore the story itself from the perspective of the people involved, but also some of the sources and research techniques I've tried to use to help resolve the mystery. And spoiler alert, this is one of those mysteries that is yet to be fully explored, unpacked and completed. So this might even be a call to help as well. These are some of the earliest pictures we've found of my grandmother, Erica Doreen Fuller. The one on the left we think was taken when she was a couple of years old, when she, we think, was fostered to a family in Belgium. Here she is in the middle, probably about the same age, maybe a bit younger, on a beach which we now believe to be in Knock in Belgium, a small coastal resort, the playground of the rich and famous, but also a place where unmarried mothers would go and have their child to be then informally fostered on. And there's a lovely little picture of her in a hat around about the same time. Now, we knew little about her early life, and there's a number of brick walls to her story that proved very hard to unpack. Firstly, she claimed not to know any of her parents. Secondly, she was born overseas, and it took a number of years before we were able to find confirmation that she had indeed been born in Knokke and not, as her passport claimed, in Antwerp. Lots of red herrings in this family. But we also had a collection of photographs, including this one here, which we've been able to piece together over the years with a little bit of sleuthing and some of the stories that she would reveal during her childhood. She was very cagey about her background, possibly out of shame, possibly out of ignorance. But we do know that she was brought up by a foster family in England, having come over, aged about 3 in 1914, from Belgium. And they were Isabella Gracie Kennedy and Alice Hancock, her companion. And I'll come on to them in a little bit more detail. We've also got two other characters here. Arthur Lewis Chase, the chap at the back, who for some time we thought might actually be her father, but transpires to be a friend of the family, an American who was able to travel more freely onto the continent and as a family friend was sent, we believe, on a mission to get my grandmother, Erica Doreen Fuller, back from where she'd been placed with, we think, a foster family in Belgium, to be handed into the care of Isabella and Alice. And this family picture, because that is really what it is, includes my grandmother's grandmother, Jane Davis Gillan, confirmed once we had found the baptism record in Knock. Now, this looks like a happy picture, but if you look carefully at my grandmother's face, she doesn't really know what's going on. And this is because, having been brought across the channel, she met Isabella and Alice at a place in Putney, we believe, where Isabella and Alice had previously been based. Alice had been born in Putney. And for various reasons that this talk is too short to go into, she too had been fostered and lost contact with her parents and had been handed to the care of Isabella Gracie Kennedy when she was a child. And when Isabella entered semi-retirement, she took over the running of the children's home. But by 1914, this business had ended, and we were trying to establish how on earth Chase and the Gillans made contact with Kennedy and Hancock so that my grandmother could be handed to their care. This was taken in Putney because there's wonderfully on the back of the photograph the photographer's studio noted, and we think this was the rendezvous and handover point for my grandmother to her new charges. Using a combination of genealogical and house history techniques, we did a little bit of digging into Isabella and Alice and the place where they ended up, which was about as far removed from Putney or Belgium as you can imagine. In terms of its remote location, this was Manor Farm House. Now, it's clear from the census return in 1921 that they'd been there for a number of years, and we can trace their residency through trade directories and also some of the voters' lists. But as we see in this will for Isabella, dated in 1917, it is quite a complicated picture. Alice had a sister, Hannah, and she had also gone into service and had ended up in Exeter, where she'd met a chap called Harold Durgis. They got married and Harold went off to war. But during the conflict, he was blinded by mustard gas and then returned to also join this collection of people at Manor Farm. And he appears on that list of registered voters and indeed seems to be somehow connected with the lease of the property. Although equally, it would appear that Isabella Kennedy was noted in trade directories and also voters lists as being the main property owner, or at least lessee. So we've got this complicated family situation with Alice and her sister and her husband, based at Manor Farm House, presided over by Isabella, who we think holds the lease, looking after my grandmother, who was aged 3 in 1914 and stayed there for at least the next 6 years before she transfers to a private boarding school in Kent in 1921 and then onwards to Sleep Hall. My grandmother speaks very fondly of her time at Manor Farm House, but I can't help but think it must have been quite a lonely existence. Here she is, another one of her family pictures, taken by photographer unknown, outside Manor Farm House, probably a year or so, maybe slightly less, after she's come over from Belgium. We believe not speaking a huge amount of English. And there she is, a small girl on her own with two much older single women, Isabella reaching retirement age, if not beyond, Alice certainly into her late 30s and 40s, rattling around this large farmhouse in the middle of nowhere. The map of East Beckham, with the house highlighted, really does not begin to tell the story of just how isolated this place was. We believe that my grandmother went to the local school, but there's no evidence in the school logbooks or any of the surviving material that this was the case. She might well have been educated by Alice and Isabella in the house itself. But either way, in this era, it would have been quite a long walk across secluded fields and country lanes to get to a school should you have done that. But if you'd wanted to hide somebody, East Beckham is probably the best place. The house itself is tucked away down a couple of lanes. Nowadays they're quite overcrowded, but there's reason to believe they would have been quite overshadowed by trees, very hard to find at that time as well. Which begs the question, how on earth did they come by this property? Why were they drawn to this location? And more importantly, how was this funded? In an attempt to find out a little bit more about the backstory and the selection of this property, I decided to have a look at some of the traditional house history sources, and this for me is one of the great unused sources for both genealogy and house history, the 1910 Valuation Office Survey, created to understand the rateable value of property around the country, with a set of ordnance survey maps created and annotated so that every property was given its own unique illegitimate number, and that then corresponded to a field book where key information was captured about the property. And in this case, Manor Farm House appears. But it appears as part of a much larger estate. It's part of Manor Farm itself. And by looking at the Valuation Office field book, it's clear that the property itself was owned by a Reginald Cosley Batt, who lived down the road at Gresham Hall. And the farm itself was leased out to a Donald Drain. Now, you could film an entire episode of Who Do You Think You Are about the life of Reginald Batt, a really tragic story. He married in 1903 to Violet Knowles. They lived in London, had 4 children together, but tragically she died 7 years later. He remarried in 1913, and his second wife dies a few years after that in 1924. He lived just down the road at Gresham Hall, which he had purpose built for his first family. And again, you get this sense of a bit of a recluse. So whether he had some sort of connection via London to the Gillen family is at this point uncertain. He was in the armed forces, and other members of the Gillen family were likewise. In fact, it may well be that that was how the connection was made, although from investigations so far. My grandmother's mother and her brother seemed to be connected on the continent into India and with various military connections, society through London. So it might be through that link as well. As I said, it is just really hard to say. But it's clear that Reginald had a tough life. Even after the loss of his second wife, his woes were not over. His 4 sons went to war. 3 of them died in the Second World War, and he died pretty much alone in 1952. So this is the mystery of Manor Farm House. And as I said at the beginning, I've yet to resolve the connection between the house, its occupants, and its owners. There aren't any surviving lease books for this area, and the ones that do exist tend to be at a much higher level. And there's certainly nothing that gives us a definitive lease or connection of the farm, let alone the house, from Reginald Batt to his land agent Donald Drain, and then onwards to the Gillen family. I guess it's one of those mysteries that is just simply going to remain there, a bit of an itch that I'll come back and scratch every now and again. But it's been fun tracking it down, and every now and again when you have a look at those family albums, don't forget to have a look at the house, because those walls contain many of the formative moments and points of relaxation, points of development, points of growth, points of education that we can only begin to speculate about. And this last picture here, I think, shows that from that initial sad image of my grandmother with a hoop and top, here she is, I believe, with her grandmother, with various dolls, and looking a lot happier with her life. She always spoke fondly about her time at Manor Farm House, and indeed in later life she returned to Norfolk on a regular basis. So even though I can't resolve the mystery, I am satisfied that it was not a terrible experience for her.